Yo, what's up, guys? The Insane Game Freak here. So, I figured we're getting ready for the Thanksgiving, the Turkey Day, the day of rest and enjoyment. Although it's also the day of celebrating the coming together of two different people, one of which hurt and savagely, brutally murdered the other. Hey, that's what America's built on. I'm just listen. At the end of the day, I think the point of this holiday is to give thanks. And if you want to start arguing the historical semantics, this ain't the place or time to do it. Do that later, when I'm not eating my food and enjoying the company of my family and friends. But anyways, for the rest of you, it's just another day anyways. That's besides the point. Anywho, let's talk about Sony. So, this, I wouldn't say recently came to my attention. I've known for a little while. But I think it's more and more information is starting to come out on it, so now we can have like a full-on conversation about it. So there's been this weird thing with Sony lately where a bunch of fucking games, Japanese games to be specific, have been getting censored. And I don't mean like, oh, maybe they have a different rating or something. I mean like old school Nintendo kind of censoring. And a lot of people are kind of confused as to why this is happening and what's going on. Now, the first case I ran across was the Senran Kagura case. Now, for those who know, Senran Kagura, the anime beat-em-up game where you see a bunch of jiggle physics and scantily clad teenage girls running around, fighting and ripping each other's clothes off. That series, that started on the 3DS, mind you, the first game on the 3DS is getting a remake for the PlayStation 4 this year. Now, this remake is already out in Japan, and it's coming out in America, but it got delayed. And some of you might be asking, why did it get delayed? Is it localization? No, it's actually for something else. They're removing a feature out of the game. And what feature is this? Oh, it's the feature in which, now it's like the dressing room feature. I think in the game it's called like the intimacy mode. Essentially, it's the feature where you can go into the dressing room, mess with the girl's breasts with like your controller. You can squirt them with water. You can, I think, depending on the game, you can get them to like hold your hand and then you can kiss them. It's like the imaginary, like it's essentially like the mess around dating sim area, which has been in every other Senran Kagura game to my knowledge, and is also in other Senran Kagura games that are on the PS4. But for whatever reason, the American version of the game is getting that removed, which is weird. But apparently, Sony's not just doing this with just Senran Kagura. It's like every anime game that has questionable content from it. And it's getting to the point where even Nintendo Switch's versions of these games are way more uncut. There's even a couple of like erotic visual novel games that are on Switch and PS4 and Steam. And PS4 has resorted to the old school light beams trick. Remember that shit? And actually, that still happens in anime, where if it's a harem anime or like an ecchi anime that's airing on like normal day television and on a like well-known channel, instead of you seeing the full-on nipples and everything, they'll do the little light beams that don't make any sense. That's what Sony is resorting to in the game. They're just censoring the game with these giant light beams, which ironically enough, in some situations, make the characters look more lewd than they were if you just took away the light beam. So I don't get the logic. Now, some of you might be asking, what the hell's going on? Why is Sony all of a sudden pushing for this weird level of censorship? Especially that up until maybe like a year ago, this wasn't even an issue. Well, I've learned that apparently Sony's main headquarters is no longer in Japan. It's actually in America now. It's in California, to be precise. They've made Sony's home base is in California. And the problem with this is that also their new policy requires you to check in with that base before you do anything, before you even put your game out on their console. And they're being dicks about it because they're like, well, you're required to speak English. So if you're in Japan and you're trying to get to a Sony Japanese contact or just a Sony contact, and you're a game developer, for example, you're the makers of Senran Kagura, in order to get your game passed on, it has to go through the California check. But there's also a difference in time zone. So you got to have someone up at like 4 o'clock in the morning just to be able to talk to people in Sony's main branch in California at an acceptable time, and then have a conversation with them, hoping to God you got someone in your office, in your game studio's office, that speaks English, because they ain't about that fucking life. And you're sitting there going, wait a minute, why would Sony, a Japanese company, go so far to kind of like ignore the Japanese devs? Well, from what I understand and from what Sony has mentioned, it seems to be a thought process that, and this is my speculation, is that I think Sony doesn't think the Japanese market is making money. And to be fair, if you've noticed over this generation alone, a lot of their games have been definitely more Western focused. Most of their exclusives have been Western focused. Graded the third party Japanese exclusive, and even some of the third party Japanese exclusives aren't like so far into the Japanese mindset that you can even call them Japanese games. Like Final Fantasy 15 is so westernized. Do you really call that a Japanese game? Well, yeah, technically, because it was made in Japan, but the way it was developed, it obviously had Western sensibilities in mind. So I think, and to be fair, it's not like Sony's reasoning behind this is flawed. Like, to be absolutely fair to them, America has been buying video games more consistently than Japan has. Japan is definitely shifting to the mobile market. That's part of the reason why the PS4, even though it's selling as great as it is, was losing to the Wii U in Japan for a while, and also is losing to the Switch consistently in Japan currently, because Japan wants more of a mobile experience, and they're drifting further and further away from consoles. And I think Sony is noticing this, so Sony's just like, well, fuck it. Now, that doesn't really explain the censoring, because even though, okay, fine, you don't really want to focus on Japanese game development as much, why make Japanese developers struggle even more to put their games out on your system? There's already been kind of a shift between like PS Vita and PSP developers into Nintendo Switch developing, because that's essentially what the Switch has become for a lot of Japanese developers, is like a continuation of the Vita or the PSP to them. So, what you're really doing now is you're taking your Japanese exclusive games, which for a lot of people, myself included, was the main differentiating feature between you and Xbox. The only two things that differentiated you guys were your exclusives and your Japanese exclusives, because we all know Xbox doesn't sell in Japan, and a lot of Japanese games aren't put on Xbox because they don't sell on Xbox, or they don't sell nearly as well as they do on PlayStation. So why take one of your bigger strengths in the console market and be like, because here's the thing, even if Japanese games aren't selling in Japan, they're still selling in America, goddammit. It's not like Americans aren't playing Japanese games. Now, granted, it definitely is more niche, but still, it's not like they're not making money. Persona 5 is a good example. That shit sold gangbusters. Nier sold well. Xenoblade 2 sold well. It's not like we're against Japanese games with Japanese sensibilities, alright? So I don't understand why make the developers and the fans suffer just because you move offices. But I also think this might be because of management. I think there's just new management over there in the California office, and I think they have their own little agenda, because it doesn't make any fucking sense why all of a sudden, even if you want to shift your focus to more Western focused games, to just burn the part of your fan base that's been dedicated to you, or burn the developers you've been good with for so long, because now you've made it a struggle for them not only to talk to you and have the conversation to release the game, but now they gotta fucking they gotta make sure the game fits your taste. And this was the problem they had with fucking Nintendo back in the day. Then Nintendo wanted to censor everything and make them spend more development, because people don't realize that shit takes time. It's not like, oh, I can just press a button and now there's no more blood or nudity in the game. I gotta go into a cutscene and re-render that shit or change it in a way that doesn't show cleavage. And I'm already spending enough money to make the game as it is. Censoring is a bitch, and it takes up extra resources for something that really isn't necessary. And this is why I'm thinking Sony might be getting into its level of arrogance that it used to be in. also think it might be suffering from terrible fucking management. Which, unfortunately, when it comes to big companies, the only way that shit is fixed is either the management learns or they get fired. Or they leave. And we don't know which we're going to have to go through to get what we want. But I find that kind of a shame. Sony, it's like, of all the things you could be doing right now, why start burning the Japanese fan base? And granted, this gives, depending on how far and how long this lasts, depends on how the landscape changes. But I would not be surprised that in the coming months or even the next year or two, if we start seeing an influx, and we've already been seeing an influx, but more of an influx of Japanese PS4 games getting Switch ports or just being Switch games or Switch exclusives entirely. Because some developers don't have the time or money to be playing this back and forth. Because obviously, but the reason, because here's the reason why people will still put up with it now, is because Sony is the market leader. They have the most consoles out, so there is the most money to be made, and they also have a market that is dedicated to playing their consoles. The Switch might be catching up, but it doesn't have as big of a fucking player base right now as Sony does. So of course Sony is the safest bet, but the line is starting to be drawn in the sand of how much bull people are going to want to be, how much bull the Japanese developers are going to want to put up with, especially because the fan service games are like half of the games that people want to play. Not all of them, mind you, but there are a good chunk of games. And people don't like shit being censored. This is the reason why people got mad at Nintendo. And Nintendo changed its tune. Because it takes too much time and effort to censor shit. And you're burning the fans on it. And you're pissing off your developers. Because now I gotta go back and change something in the game. No one wants to do that shit. So, this could potentially be the start of something very bad for Sony if they don't get their shit together. And unfortunately, because they're in California, and I think the new people that are doing these content policies don't give a fuck about freedom of speech or freedom of art and would rather censor games, they're going to cause the same shit. And I think this needs to be brought to attention. It's the same shit that aggravated me with Nintendo. People were mad when they fucked up with Fate's translation, when they start censoring outfits in Fatal Frame and Tokyo Mirage Sessions. What was the other game? Or the petting feature in Fate. Like, Fates in general is just a weird censored fucking mess, alright? And we don't want to put up with that crap. That's actually, I think that's going to be the true test of when Fire Emblem 3 Houses come out. Have we fully gotten out of the age of Nintendo going out of its way to censor shit? Because it's still changing. Even in Xenoblade 2. Xenoblade 2 was a huge step for us because we were like, this game probably should have been heavily censored considering how Nintendo tends to do things. But they were fair and gave us essentially the same game. I think the only thing they changed, which is a little dumb, but considering 90% of the game is good, and they've made strides as far as Nintendo's concerned, was I think they changed how Shiba, in the Japanese version, Shiba is like full out lesbian. In the English version, she's just very fond of women. So, but the point I'm making is, we're going to see how much of a stink gets raised over the coming months to the years and see if Sony wants to keep playing this fucking game. Because as I've seen from the community who cares about these games, and these games are important, motherfuckers don't take censorship lightly. So it would not surprise me if people start drawing lines in the sand saying, fuck it, I'll buy the Switch version or the PC version. Because I think people have already said that. When they found out about the Senran Kagura situation, I think people are buying the PC version. Why? Because we don't want to put up with that shit. Listen, if I spend $60 on a game, I want the full fucking game. I don't want to feel like I have to go import the Japanese version. And the PC version is uncensored, so there's going to be either an influx to PC games, PC sales for those kind of games, or Switch sales, depending on what kind of console gaming you are. But see, this is a war I don't think you want to fight. I think Nintendo realized that. I guess you got to go through the same growing pains, or those dumbasses in California, they're going to have to learn the hard way. This is not how you playing games. But I think the problem is that Sony, I don't think, values Japanese game development as much anymore. And that's my concern, that they may not ever change. But hey, never say never. No, don't make the joke. Anyways, leave your thoughts and comments in the comment section below. This has been the Insane Game Freak. Once again, in a win, and I'll catch you guys later. Peace. Oh.